Good morning. Thank you all for coming. My name is Hannah Del Porto, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Brick Factory, which is a Drupal development shop in Washington, D.C. So before I start, I just wanted to mention that pretty much all of the major points I'm going to make are in my speaker notes of my presentation. So that's going to be posted for you guys after the conference, so you're more than welcome to write down any brilliant ideas that you have, but my brilliant ideas are already recorded for you. So if you work with programmers but you aren't one, it can sometimes be frustrating to communicate with the technical side of your team. You know, they really have a separate vocabulary, they have different processes, and sometimes they have some seemingly quirky or unusual work habits. So I'm just going to talk a bit about ways to bridge that gap and have better communication across the teams and help you work better together. So we're going to start by learning a little bit about the traits of programmers, and particularly some expectations we may have that aren't always realistic or accurate. So there are a lot of stereotypes and myths about developers. To start, programmers are not psychic. This is really important because we often have really unrealistic expectations for them. A few of these. They don't have access to information, specs, or requirements that we don't give them. They don't know how their code is going to be used or abused by end users. And they don't know how someone else's code works just by looking at it, just by watching it function. So in this, they're also not encyclopedias. In this tweet, Tim's saying, "Hello, my name is Tim. I'm a lead at Google with over 30 years coding experience, and I need to look up how to get the length of a Python string." So he's saying that despite having decades of experience, he needs to look up one of the very first functions that you learn when you learn Python. Programmers don't usually have photographic memories. They don't know every programming language, they don't know every technology, and as Tim is saying, even if it's something they've done before, even if it's something that's seemingly simple, they can't have everything memorized. So developers are smart, they're technical, and they have great attention to detail, but they're not perfect. A typical web page can have thousands of lines of code. The average phone app can have tens of thousands. You know, if that was written by a human, there's gonna be a mistake in there somewhere. And frankly, that's true of the 20-page proposal that you're writing. It's true of the 2,000-cell financial statement that I'm writing. Human beings make mistakes. So programmers aren't psychic. They're not encyclopedias, and they're not perfect. Then what are they? And notice this says generalizations, not truths, about programmers. So much like you have attributes that help you excel at your job, there are some attributes that are really common in developers because it helps them be good at programming. So this says, being a programmer. My mom said, "Honey, please go to the market and buy 1 bottle of milk. If they have eggs, bring 6. I came back with 6 bottles of milk. She said, "Why the hell did you buy 6 bottles of milk?" I said, "Because they have eggs." So this is a stereotype too, that developers are super literal. But quite frankly, they have to be to talk to computers. You know, your computer is literal. If you want it to go to sleep, but you tell it to shut down, what is your computer going to do? So developers have to create very complex series of commands to talk to your computer. And they have to be sure that at the end of all of those commands, the outcome is going to be what was intended. So using that logic is an extremely foundational and important part of being a developer. Programmers also have to be really good at problem solving. Ideally, programmers are spending most of their time writing code that, you know, even if it isn't new to the universe, is new to them. And that's especially true of open source developers like the ones who share code through Drupal. Programmers also have, I'm going to read this. This is a famous American mathematician and computer scientist who wrote The Art of Programming. And he says, computer programming is an art because it applies accumulated knowledge to the world, because it requires skill and ingenuity, and especially because it produces objects of beauty. So there are many ways to solve a problem through code. Also, developers have a lot of competing values that they have to balance. So they have to balance deadlines with requirements, flexibility with stability, as well as, frankly, the current reality they're working in to an unknowable future. So developers are logical, they're creative, and they're good at problem solving. We're going to look at why those attributes matter in programming and what that means to you. First, development is really more about thinking and planning than it is about actually typing the code out. One of our developers is really famous for building these beautiful, complicated structures out of his business cards. And so other people from other departments would walk by and be like, what the hell is that guy doing? He's at work and he's just building all this weird stuff on his desk. And the answer to that is he's programming. Just as you wouldn't build a house without thinking it through and designing it first, in order to write software, you have to think through and plan how you're going to approach it before you can ever type the code. So why do you care about the thinking and planning involved in programming? So again, one of the reasons that programming requires all of that upfront thinking is the foundation of a program has to be written first. And this means that sometimes even small changes requested once that foundational code is laid can result in a lot of extra work. I love the analogy of house building to programming for a lot of reasons, but if you look at this, you know, if you want to add an extra room to this house, at what point are you going to ask the builder for it? Preferably before he's built walls, for sure before he's put a roof on that thing, and development is really kind of the same situation. And that is why you will face such fierce resistance to coming in the middle of development and changing the rules. In a lot of situations, you're asking that developer to tear down code they've already built in order to make the code fit your new vision. And I know that some of you are guilty of asking the developer to tear the wall down, add a new room, and do it all under the original deadline. So this chart shows, this is about fixing bugs, but it also applies to scenarios where you're making feature adjustments. And when you first look at this, you're like, oh, so making changes in the first few phases of development don't take that much time. But what this is actually showing you is the time doubles and triples across each of these scenarios. It's just that changing it post-launch is such a disaster that it makes the previous phases look not so bad. So what can you do about it as a non-technical person at your company? This is an actual quote from one of our project managers. She said, "The more information I provide, the better the end result is." And that is probably the number one thing you can do to improve outcomes in development is just provide as much information as you can in that thinking and planning part as opposed to the coding part. So this means doing a very thorough discovery, proactively trying to talk about assumptions and determine what information is missing. And I also find it helps to put yourself in the shoes of the developer and just think, if I were building this, what information would I need? And I think for a lot of people, especially those who are dealing directly with the clients, that helps you think of information that you might have come across more informally and give the developers more context about what they're working on. So next, programming requires concentration. I'm sure that you've heard this before, and you may have even seen this cartoon. So basically, you have this little programmer, and he is thinking through the logic of what he's working on. He's working it through, and all of a sudden, his little work buddy comes by and just starts a conversation. And his whole train of thought just evaporates, and he's back to square one. So because programming does require a lot of conceptual planning, it requires developers to hold a certain chain of thought in their head long enough to work it to its logical conclusion, determine that that approach is going to work, and then record it. So they are constantly threatened by losing that progress that they've made. And I feel like everybody has had this experience at some point. If you're writing, you know what you're going to say, you kind of have it worked out in your head. If you get interrupted, often it's really hard to get back that idea that you had, and sometimes it's lost forever. So why do you care about programmers losing their precious little trains of thought? I feel like this one's pretty self-explanatory. Besides the inefficiency, there is often anger. And what can you do about it? Well, basically, developers just need some blocks of time to get through their work. And the tactics that you employ really depend on your particular company and culture, but I'm just gonna go through a few things that work really well for us. So the number one thing is to manage meetings, just make them intentional. Scheduling meetings into blocks so they're not interrupting the entire day, making sure meetings have an agenda and a really clear purpose. And then the number one thing that we found for us is to actually have the discussion before the meeting happens. So we send out an email and we say, these are the things we're gonna talk about, what are your thoughts? I've noticed that people are really, and myself included, are really terrible about thinking through big picture things in the moment. And so you let them think about it on their own time. You let them send that information, their thoughts, what they noticed on their own time, then other people respond on their own time. And then when you've gotten through that, you set a meeting where everybody knows the background and you can focus on making decisions and determining what you're actually gonna do about it and not sit there for 3 hours hashing stuff out. We also have rules about how to contact developers. So we typically use our PM software for information that can wait a few hours. And that means developers don't need to be checking their email all day. Then we use some sort of instant message, or we use Slack, but something like that, if the information affects the current task that they're working on, or if it's really time sensitive, if it's something that needs to be done in the next few hours. Then we pick up the phone if there's a legit emergency, like their last deployment resulted in death and destruction. And this is also why all of our developers work remotely. As it turns out, they're just not huge fans of the drop by and chat culture that exists in our office. We also have a system for developers and anyone else to block off hours of their day. So for us, that means going offline. So you post to our general chat, you say, I'm going offline from 2 to 5. That's your block of time to focus on the project that you're working on, and everyone knows that if they need you, they need to call you on the phone, and preferably not to do that. And this is useful for anybody. I mean, designers also need blocks of time to work. Project managers have to write proposals, or they have to do specs, or your QA person needs to be focused on that. So this system is really good for anybody who's just like, I need a block of time to focus. So next, programmers make assumptions. They actually have to make a lot of assumptions to even get through their work. I think you know why assumptions can be dangerous, but let's say that you ask your friendly neighborhood developer to add an address field to your already existing database. It sounds really easy. Except this is a non-comprehensive list of data rules about addresses, each with a real-world exception. Here are a few of them. It's super boring. An address will start with, or at least include, a building number. Not really. When there's a building number, it will be all numeric. No buildings are numbered 0. A building number will only be used once per street. You can't have 2 towns with the same name in the same country. All of this stuff is not true. So there is no truth to data. There's no simple when it comes to data. So what sounds like a simple request to you actually means that your developer has to make a shitload of assumptions to even get any work done. What can you do about that? So one of the assumptions that developers often make is that you understand the consequences of what you're asking. If you don't say, is there any reason we shouldn't do this? Or is there any reason we shouldn't do it this way? They may not point out potential problems because they think you already understand that. They think you already realize what you're asking them to do. So asking is a good idea. Another big one is setting expectations. And I've been doing this for 17 years, and I actually failed at this like 2 weeks ago. So there was an internal development task that was sitting around in the backlog, and for some reason, I knew who had to work on it, that somebody in particular built it, and for some reason I just decided to remind him of it. I don't know, I was like, you remember this thing? Like, don't forget about it. I know. And he responded, okay, I'll take a look, and if it's quick, I will just handle it. What happens if you do not define quick with the developer? So, I mean, that's like really basic stuff, but again, I've been doing this for over a decade and it just didn't occur to me. So if you have a task that you want a developer to look into, but you're gonna lose your shit if it takes more than 2 hours, you wanna mention that before they actually start. And this is often true of requirements gaps. So as we saw in that address example, it is impossible for you to talk about all scenarios. Okay, it can be really helpful if you proactively point out to your developers information you know is missing. That way they know what they have to assume, they know what they have to work around, and talking about the assumptions both of you are making is a really good start to avoid painful surprises later. I was really surprised. I talked to dozens of developers from several different companies to get their input for this presentation. And I was shocked that the #1 thing they said was, do not use words that you do not understand. When you use a technical term, a developer assumes that you're using it in the same way that they understand it. So if you learn dev terminology and you're comfortable with it, that's awesome. If you're confident, go for it. But if you don't, if you're not really sure what you're talking about, that's okay. They don't expect you to be developers, so don't fake it. Just explain to them what you need. They're really fine with that, but do not pretend that you understand dev terminology if you don't, because you could end up giving them some really bad instructions. And sorry, 1 second. That's weird. So, there we go. Programming has best practices. So programmers actually have a lot of standards that they need to follow. You have standards in the language they're using, for the frameworks they're using, like our Drupal coding standards, conventions in their department, and then they have a lot of overarching standards that they have to think about too for flexibility, reusability, readability, maintainability, all the abilities. So why do you care? Especially in an agency setting, but in many environments, we put pressure on developers to deliver code as quickly as possible. And this often encourages them, and sometimes, frankly, forces them to compromise on those standards. And this can lead to real consequences later. So how can you help? Try to schedule work to allow developers to plan and execute work according to best practices. Also understand the trade-offs that you're asking developers to make. So as we saw earlier in the presentation, making adjustments later in the life cycle of a project increases implementation time. So if you think that you're going to need to modify a project or even maintain that code in the future, and by maintain I mean ever touch or use again, you need to give devs time to implement the code practices that are going to support those long-term needs. So next, give programmers a reason. Programmers actually like to know what they're trying to accomplish and why, rather than just following instructions. Why does that matter? So we talked about how limiting information means that developers have to make more assumptions about their work. Without knowing the purpose or the end goal of the project, they may end up making bad choices as a result of those assumptions. So what can you do about it? I'm glad you asked. Tell them the problem, not the solution. Explain what you're trying to achieve, and you will get much better feedback from them about how to approach it. And developers, for the most part, really like solving problems. A lot of the time, that's why they went into programming in the first place. Also, tell them the story behind the work. Although this is not strictly necessary for getting work done, I think giving them that context helps them sort of balance those competing values. It also helps them figure out if what you want to do makes sense in the first place. So if you tell them what you're ultimately trying to achieve, they may have an alternative approach for you. They may have another idea that even makes more sense. I've had programmers stop me from doing really dumb shit by accidentally explaining what I was trying to do. And that's how I learned to explain on purpose what I'm trying to do. I think it's also helpful to explain the significance of the work. So that helps them prioritize things when everything is important, and it helps them feel invested in the outcome. So I think a lot of the times if you're a project manager or somebody who deals with the clients, you kind of know why it's important. You know if the end client is being featured on a TV show, you know if they're having some kind of crisis come up. And especially if you're asking a lot of your developers, if it's a big project that they're gonna work on for a long time, or if there's a tight turnaround, it can help them just feel, know what their contribution means in the real world if you give them the context of the work they're doing. So programmers also don't understand you. Just like how some of the stuff programmers do, is a mystery to you, they also don't understand a lot of stuff about your job. So why does this matter? Educating developers on the non-technical part of your company is just as important as learning what they do. That obviously improves communication, but it also helps developers make decisions that support the actual goals, the greater goals and values of the company. And what can you do about it? Well, the first thing is obviously to educate them on the work that you do. And this can just kind of happen while you're working together. Explain to them what your role is, why you're taking the approach you are, the rationale behind your decisions, and again, giving them that why behind the actual work that you're doing together. I found that cross-functional debriefs or retros are also a really, really good time for this. And if you're paying attention, this is a time where a lot of misunderstanding comes up between the teams on why you did things a certain way, or what kind of constraints you were under. So look for those misunderstandings and take the time in that moment to educate the other teams on why you did what you did. And our client management team has actually started a cool tradition at our company, which is that we do lunch and learns. So we buy lunch for everybody, and then somebody volunteers to do a presentation to just tell more about something they've learned, or like I recently did one on dealing with client criticism. It just makes you feel really bad, and it's about how that's something that a lot of people have to deal with. And this is really good for cross-functional training. So you can, the most recent one we did was our dev team explaining to the project managers how repos work. So you also want to be really open and honest with your developers. So if a client asks you to do something stupid that you just have to do anyway, just say that. Just be honest with them. If you don't understand what they're saying, ask for an explanation. If you disagree with their approach, say that and have a conversation about it. The more upfront you are with them, the more comfortable they will feel coming to you if they have a problem. So these are the major points we just went through, and hopefully we have a pretty good idea of what programmers are like in real life now. So we're going to focus on the more practical side of working with developers and actually doing work with them. And the first area is task management, pretty basic. So the first thing is we want to keep tasks nuclear, and that means as small as possible. One task, one ticket, or you end up with threads of 150 comments that no one can use. And this also obviously helps devs close things out, and it shows everybody where your priorities and your progress are. Yeah, and report bugs awesomely. So be really thorough with your bug reports. Give them all of the information. Don't make them do work that you've already done. Vet bugs before submitting, and that means making sure they're not user error. That means checking the functional specs to make sure it's actually a bug and it's not doing what it's supposed to be doing. And this is harder, but try to consolidate your bugs into one report. It is far easier for your developers to look at everything at once and approach the bugs in a logical manner than to do them piecemeal as you find them. So, your bug report. What exactly did you do? What exactly happened when you did it? What exactly were you expecting to happen? And how exactly can your developer reproduce that error? Give a clear description of the problem, include links, screenshots, video, operating system, browser, whether you were logged in. It is impossible to include too much information in your bug report. Lay it on them, give them everything. And estimates, I know, everybody's favorite. Okay, so whether you're using hours or days or points, we pay and are paid for time, so at some point you're gonna end up estimating it. This is one of the biggest areas of conflict that I've seen between developers and everybody else in the universe, and we could literally talk about this all day. So I'm actually just going to make a couple major points. I think we often forget what an estimate is, so I actually looked it up. It is a guess, an approximation, a likely price. This means that estimates are going to be wrong because they are not a fact, they are a guess. Programmers are not psychic, and they have to make a lot of assumptions in their work. So they are basing these estimates on the information that is available at the time. If you are someone who deals with the consequences of estimates, you need to have this in mind at all times throughout the process. So developers have to base their estimates on the information you give them. Sometimes you will not have good information. That is fine. It's totally fine. The important thing is that you don't expect good output from bad input. So if you don't have good information, that estimate is also not going to be awesome, and you just have to accept that and work around it. So that's it. Those are my major points. Lastly, this is some stuff that I have learned, again, through 17 years of working with developers. This is my number one tip for working with another human being. I say this all the time. And this is true of programmers, and it's true of everybody else in the world. It is not about you. Whatever the developer did to make you sad or angry, there is probably a really good reason for it. So start by asking what that was. Every single time somebody comes to me and says, so-and-so did this, I say, did you ask them why? They always come back, they always come back, and they say, oh, well, you know, she just thought this, or they actually thought we had more time, or, oh, well, they didn't know this. There's always a reason. Just go ask them why. And some really good advice from Stephen Covey and my cousin who has 5 children: treat them all the same by treating them differently. You know, some developers need to have a chat with you before they even start on a small project. Others think that's a huge waste of time and just want to see your extremely detailed written specs. Both of those things are fine. You know, get to know your developers or just ask them how they like to work. And our head of dev told me this recently, and it really stuck with me. He said most developers are really passionate about producing quality work. So if you show them that you have that same passion, that is your common ground. That really helps you guys work together. Programmers are not the enemy, okay? Remember that you are actually working on the same team towards the same goals. And always stand up for yourself. Programmers are brilliant, they're talented, they bring a lot to the table, but your role is just as important. So do respect their input and their opinions, but make sure yours are heard as well. So thank you all for coming, I really appreciate it. And I am gonna take questions from you guys, but I have to leave right after this to get to a wedding in India, so you can also contact me anytime, send me an email, tweet me, Facebook friend me, whatever, I'm around. And again, this will be the session will be posted for you guys, and everything I said is written down in there for you. So does anybody have a question for me? Yes.
Hello.
Hello.
I'm a developer. I hope it's okay I came. I really appreciated this talk, and sometimes I'll get a request from a client and I'll think, I'm not sure that they've given me the right instructions here, and I'll go back 2, sometimes 3 times to ask, to really understand what they want, and sometimes the picture will change and sometimes I just didn't get it. Can you talk to me about, or tell us about, how to improve that interaction? Because I feel like I'm annoying a customer if I ask them, I know you said this, but I just want to make sure you really want that. How can I do that in a way that's good listening and understanding and not frustrating?
So I think that's a pretty normal part of the process, and it depends on the client, obviously, how comfortable they are with working with developers and whether or not they understand the information they should be giving you. So that varies a lot. But I would say don't feel bad about that. I mean, you're trying to do the right thing for them. You're trying to help them at the end of the day. I mean, be respectful of their time. And if they're a client that loves talking on the phone, then talk on the phone. Try to consolidate all of your questions if you can, and just approach it in one batch, the same way you would want them to do with you. But I think you should think about the fact that you are looking out for their best interests. You're doing something to further their project, and not feel bad about needing to go to them for clarification, because certainly they're going to thank you for asking a question rather than spending a shitload of hours going down the wrong road because you didn't ask.
Thank you. Thanks.
Anybody else?
During the managing tasks section, you said to make the tasks nuclear. But then you almost immediately went on with the bug reporting thing. You said batch all of your bug reports together. You've just sort of said the whole consolidate points thing.
Oh, I'm sorry. So when I meant bug report, I mean every bug is separate. All of them together make a report. I do not mean send them a giant document with all the bugs, because they'll kill you. Yeah, every bug is a separate task, but put all of those things in together. So I don't know what you're using to track stuff, but put them all in and then make the dev team aware of their existence.
Thanks, Hannah, that was awesome.
Oh, thanks.
Can I get root access to your brain?
I don't see why not. We'll ask Preston about that. He probably has an idea. Anybody else? Questions? Okay, cool. Well, thanks again for coming. I appreciate it.